Yeah, we're gonna work here with removing the number 60 chain that drives the upper auger. There's a couple different things here. There's an idler sprocket, and you have to grab a 3/4 inch wrench socket. There is a slot up on top of the bracket on the side panel. You'll be able to reach in and get your wrench in to hold the flanged nylock nut, and then a 3/4 inch ratchet and loosen the sprocket. Hey, once you have it loosened, as you'll notice, you'll be able to slide the sprocket back. Now the chain's loose. Be able to remove it. And that, I guess there's a master link. You have to locate that. Here's the master link. And just like on your old bicycle, but a little stiffer and harder to work with. There, I take the clip off. Slide the link apart. There you go, and get the chain off. And now you can remove the chain. Watching that you don't get your fingers in between the sprocket and the chain, because it really hurts. I've done it before. The first thing I'm going to do is remove, this is another guide. It helps hold the snow in as you're back dragging. This is UHMW. They are a carriage bolt. And if you'll notice, I have a short bolt. It's just coming through the nylock. The reason for that is when you tighten this, for the carriage bolt to pull into the UHMW, you cannot have the engagement of the nylock first or it'll spin. So there is a reason why these are just flush. I'm going to go ahead and get a 9/16 socket. My handy little impact. Spin the nuts off. Now I'm going to tap. These are slightly stuck in. I've got a big enough hammer for the operation here, so there you go. So that part's removed. And here you can see they are actually a square hole, and there is reason for that. We don't have a hex head on the other side for clearance for our side flippers. So there you go. Okay, the reason for removing them, you wouldn't have to if you're going to work on the auger, but you'll notice when I remove these bolts, this auger slides out easier. You can finesse it out of there without taking the guides off, but I like to just take them off. It makes it easier to accomplish the task. Now this area is clear, so now you can get a 3/4 inch socket. Of course, I'm going to use my handy dandy impact here and see if I can break them loose. Pretty impressed. I haven't dropped another nut yet. This one's a little hard to get at. Okay, there. So now I've got one side removed. I'm going to show you when I pull these fasteners out, you'll notice there's a 1/2 inch thick piece of metal along this side. So there is a longer fastener used on the outside. There's 4 fasteners, 3 are the same, and 1 is longer, but when you take it apart, you'll notice that. We do run a flat washer on the outside, so when you're tightening, you can actually tighten from the outside and it'll rotate on the washer, not on the painted surface. So anyway, I'm going to take 3 of these out, and the auger will hang there now. Now I'm going to go over on the other end and remove those. Once again, they're a 3/4 inch wrench. I'm going to remove 3 of them. And then the last one, all I do is loosen it so the auger doesn't fall. Now, I'm going to get my assistant, Noah, here to help me take this out. You pull the last fastener out and then slide the auger out. There you go. I'm going to go through here how to remove our side flipper. You'll have to get 1 1/8" socket and an 1 1/8" wrench. The first thing that you should do is pin this up, because when you unbolt it, if it falls or pivots down in between here, it could be pretty serious. So use caution when working with this. It is heavy. There's no springs on this. It just uses its mass to float and follow the ground. So it is heavy. Grab here, I've got an impact. You could use a ratchet to do this, but for simplicity, I've got an impact. Remove the nut. Now is when I'd remove this pin. There we go. And repeat on the other side, going through the same process. Take the nut loose. We'll remove the side flipper. This is heavy. The reason for that, we use the mass of it to keep the thing down and engaged rather than any springs. And the next thing this is kind of a shortcut, if I'd call it that. You can remove the hydraulic hoses from the block. All that involves, you have to have a bucket, loosen the fasteners up. You'll drain out a 1/2 gallon of hydraulic oil. You can remove the whole auger. What I'm going to show you is a shortcut to get at that. What we do is loosen the fasteners on this end, take the fasteners out of the other end, and suspend the end of the auger at an angle. Therefore, we can get at the fan. Now that you've got the bolts loose, what I'd go in and do is see that you just have the nuts barely engaged. The reason for that is the auger won't hang on these hoses. Now I'm going to move to the other end, and I'm actually going to remove the fasteners, letting the auger hang down at an angle so I can get at the fan. Here I'm going to remove all 4 of these bolts, but I'm just going to do 3 at first so the auger doesn't fall down. Okay, now I've got all 4 nuts off. Now this auger will be loose. What I'm going to do is usually I use a bungee strap, and you'll see I've removed the side guide. And there's the top hole, if you hook the rubber strap in there, or you had a rope or whatever, or if you have another person around to help you, it's probably not a bad idea. So why don't you come in here, Noah, and help me grab this auger. Noah, help hold it up. I'm going to remove this fastener. Now the fastener's removed, then we're going to wiggle the auger out. So now this auger can actually hang there without doing any damage. But I've got this strap on. You'll see now the auger's hanging at an angle. The reason for that is I did not have to remove the hydraulic lines, lose hydraulic oil. Obviously you could do that. This is just a shortcut. So now you can see I can get at the fan. Now that we've got everything moved out of the way that we can get at the fan to remove it if you had a damaged fan. If you were just replacing the hydraulic motor or putting a different size on, you would not need to remove the augers. You can reach in, loosen the fastener, and I'll go through that with you, how to remove the fan from the motor. But you need to move the auger to be able to get the fan out of the shroud because there's close tolerances. You can see the auger, we've got it rotated what I'd call in the worst position, but you still can reach in to take the nut off. Here you need an 1.5 inch socket, and on this I'd really recommend that you have an impact, an air impact or electric impact, and don't have an extension on it, because that flex makes the nut not come loose as easy. Another thing, it's quite an echo chamber. I'm old and I can't hear very well, but yet when I do this, I do wear ear protection. There we go. Here you'll see, I'm going to remove my ear protection so I can hear myself talk. Here, this is what's called a castle nut. It is set up to have a key put in. We choose not to because the location is never quite proper. We do make sure that the threads are clean and run a thread locker. We use actually red Loctite product to make sure that the nut doesn't back off. Whenever you're working underneath your loader arms on any kind of attachment, you should have the arms in the locked up position. Here on this ASB, there's a stopper that you put in and a lock pin. Therefore, the arms can't come down and cause any injury. Okay, here I'm going to go through how to remove the fan motor. The first thing you do is remove, there's the hydraulic lines that run the flipper, cut the cable tie off of them to get that out of the way. Next thing you can do is you'll have to get some kind of drain bucket because there is going to be oil. These, even if they are a new blower shipped from us, they are pre-run, so they're filled with oil. There is on the bottom of this motor, you can see here it's called a case drain line. It takes the 11/16 wrench. I'd loosen that. And you're going to get some oil draining out of the motor through that case drain. And here, I think a word of caution is just be patient. If you try to hurry, you're going to have oil all over everything. So now I'm going to break these fasteners loose, then we're going to wait a while and let everything drain out. These are 1.25 inches. There's one on each side of the motor, and you'll loosen that. There you see my oil starting to drain out of that fitting. And I'm going to crack this other one loose. Now I'm going to take a little break and let these motors drain out. It just makes everything simpler. Now you've let the oil drain out of the system as well as possible, I'll start disconnecting the larger hoses. I'd used 1.25 inch wrench to loosen it first. And these I have drained the oil out. And on this 90-degree fitting on the left side of the motor, you're best to loosen the jam nut on that 90 and rotate it straight down. It's just easier to get the hose off. Not necessary, but makes it easier. Same thing, I had drained the oil out of these hoses. If you don't take time and do that, you're gonna have oil all over. So anyway, once that's done, now the hoses are off the motor. Then you get your 3/4 inch socket and remove the 4 fasteners that hold the motor on. They're a little tough to get at, pretty straightforward, but you might need different lengths, extensions, and type things to reach in at them. And then once you get the 4 bolts out, you need to use their 4-inch long full thread 1/2-inch bolts. What these are used for is to push the fan off. It's a tapered shaft, and this pushes them off the shaft, pushes the fan off the shaft. You insert them in. There is a nut on the back side that's fused into the fan housing. So as you thread this in, it'll hit the fan and push it off. I just run them all the way in. There, now the fan is pushed off. If with the camera it's a little tough to get around that side and show you, but the fan would have popped off the tapered shaft. Now I'm going to back these bolts out and the motor will come out. There we go, there's the motor removal. There's my bolt, just flew away. So if you look up in here, you can see the tapered shaft with the keyway that the motor inserts on. So you'll notice when we put the motor back in, we line the keyway up as we insert it. Then we tighten the bolts down here, go on the other side, wiggle the fan on, put the fastener on, and the motor's installed. Okay, now I'm gonna reinstall, if it's a new motor size that you're putting in or a damaged motor or whatever, here I'm ready with the new motor, I would have put the fittings required on it, 90 degree on the left side, just a straight bung on the right, and the case drain fitting, which you would take off the old motor. Okay, you see the keyway on the tapered hub on the motor. The best way to reinstall this motor is to have that keyway straight up. You can either do that once you took the nut off the outside, rotate the fan so it's straight up. Here I hadn't done that, so we're going to rotate now the fan so it's generally straight up. Go ahead, Noah. There, now the keyway is generally straight up. And we hadn't timed the motor either because I had pulled it out in a position that did not have the keyway up. So now I'm going to rotate the motor. I leave the key in it, take channel locks or whatever, and rotate the key opposite of the case drain, which would be up. There, I'm pretty close to generally straight up. So now the idea is to slide this in and not knock that keyway out. If you do, there's ways to get it back in. But then you lift the motor into position. It's a little bit heavy, but you get behind the hoses and insert it into the hole in the fan. Now is where you got to work it around to get that keyway to insert into the fan. And there, I can feel that that worked. Now you start inserting the 1/2-inch bolts with the lock washer on them. The lock washer has 2 reasons, so they don't back out. plus it steps it up, you'll see there's a ring on the motor that it doesn't clear unless you have the lock washer on. So I just start all of them finger tight, wiggling the motor around a little bit as necessary. This is the hardest one. These hoses are in the way a little bit. And once I feel that they all grabbed on, now I can grab my impact and tighten them up. I usually tighten one side slightly and then the opposite, kind of like you do a hub or a rim on a tire. Then I go around and do all four. And I check them that I got them snug. There we go. So now the motor's installed. The keyway is on the motor. What I would do is go around and wiggle the fan. Now see, and if you have a light, you can see if the keyway is in there, just to make sure that you've got the key inserted. Okay, now that you have the motor installed, we'll reinstall the hoses. I guess I'd start with the K-string. It's kind of laying in the correct position. 11/16 wrench and snug it. I've gotten used to, whenever I put hydraulic lines on, to tighten each line as I go, or I forget. So anyway, it's just a good rule of thumb. Then I'll take and go to the right hand fitting first, which is the straight fitting, bend this hose, and thread it on. Now, as you notice, once I get it threaded on, I push this hose back and rotate it in towards the blower and start tightening it. When I tighten this fastener, it wants to rotate the hose back, so I hold it in position and tighten it. Then I wipe some more oil off my wrench. Then you take the next hose that inserts down in between this other hose. You remember I had loosened this 90-degree fitting. This was the reason, because it's a lot easier to get on in this position. So I can thread it all in just so it's snug. Then same thing, I rotate this hose so it's up against the blower housing. Once that's done, then I can tighten that fitting and make sure it's rotated against snug and tighten the jam nut on the 90-degree elbow. There you go, it's installed. Okay, once you have the hoses on, then I take the the hoses that run the flipper on the chute. I lay them on top of this 90-degree fitting and put a cable tie on. I use pretty heavy-duty cable ties so they don't fracture. Weather resistant. Tighten that good and snug. Take a side cutter and clean the tail off. And that is complete. Now I'm looking down to see that I have got the keyway still in, which I still do. There I can see the keyway. If you look right down in the slot, you can see the key is still in there. So it's just a visual, and you can see I'm turning the fan and the motor's turning. The keyway is in there. So once you got the fan on, take a deep breath. It's kind of heavy. I'm using 271 thread locker. Like I said earlier, we don't use, it's a castle nut that you could use a keyway, but I don't like to do that because you're off rotation sometimes. Here, this is a brand new bottle of Loctite, and I'll grab a used one that's already open. Now I found a bottle of Loctite that's open already. Same thing as some 271, and I put that on the threads of the motor. Okay, now I grab the nut, and I also put some thread locker on the threads of the nut. Gets a little bit of red Loctite on the threads of the nut. And then start the nut by hand so you're sure the threads are lined up. Then I think I'm going to cover my Loctite up so it doesn't tip over. Grab my 1.5" socket. Now here's where it's important, more so than taking it off. If you think it's easier to get in there with a long extension, that long extension does not allow the torque wrench to impact and tighten it properly. So better to battle with it, to reach in. See how I'm reaching in between the fins, don't have an extension on it. And now this is, I forgot where I put on my ear protection, because this is pretty loud. There's a vibration and a ringing. Now I should be ready. And then I'll remove these so I can hear myself talk. It would be real hard to get in there with a torque wrench. So I use a 1/2" impact, and I impact and watch the socket turning until it quits turning. I don't keep impacting it a long time after that. It's really kind of a feel thing. What you're doing is drawing that tapered hub onto the motor. So if you use a good sized impact and impact till it quits turning, you should be fine. All right, to reinstall the right side end of the larger bottom auger, we did not take the bolts out in that end. Remember, we had just a couple threads on, so we pivoted it down so we could get the fan out to demonstrate that. Now we're going to lift it back up into position. You'll see this grease circle, we're going to want to have that facing out so you can get at it once it's applied in the snowblower. And then I'm going to have Noah help me lift this end up and line up some of the fastener holes. What I'm doing here, I used a screwdriver, inserted it into that hole. Now I'm going to take the first fastener and finesse it around. Put the first fastener in, always the toughest one, and then put the nuts on. A 3/4 inch wrench. Make sure the socket's going in the right direction. Tighten them up. There you go. Then we move to the left side of the blower and tighten the 4 1/2" bolts that we had loosened earlier. There we go. Okay, to put the upper paddle auger in, you really need to loosen this locking collar on this end. You really need to have this bearing loose on this bearing so it can float back and forth. Then you lift the auger into position. One thing here is to take care that you have the greaser in a position that you can get at it, not be on the back side of the snowblower. And put all the fasteners in both ends and tighten it up. This way, by doing this, it'll draw the auger over towards the side where both sprockets are, so the sprockets line up. That's why we let this side of the bearing loose, lock collar loose, and we'll retighten it once the 8 bolts are tightened up. Another thing to notice here is we have a thick 1/2-inch strap on the outside of the blower. So the one of the 4 bolts is a longer bolt that goes through that longer, thicker strap iron. Once you have them in, you can tighten them up. Okay, once you have the fasteners tightened, the auger has been slid over so these 2 sprockets are in line with each other for the chain. Because you remember when we talked about putting those bearings on, there's a 206 bearing on the top, 207 on the bottom, but their centering is the same. So the outside of the inner race goes flush with the shaft on both augers. Now the chain sprockets will line up. We had left this lock collar loose. This end of the auger, paddle auger, we left this collar loose, as you remember. So when we tightened the sprocket end up, it moved the auger over to line up both sprockets. Now I'm going to come over and lock this locking collar. So once you get the collar inserted, take a center punch. Be careful not to pound on the Allen key. I've seen people do that and it really irritates you. There's a little countersunk hole that you tap on. And that, it's an off-centric, so that tightens up the collar. Then you rotate into position so you can get at the Allen screw to keep it from backing up. Snug that Allen screw. And that end is secure. Now we'll move to the other end and we'll put the chain on. Okay, we're gonna install the chain. Here now, this is a real finger pincher, watch out. As you start rolling these augers and getting your fingers in there, and you end up like me with chopped off ends of your fingers and such. So just be careful. You notice I slid the adjuster up out of the way, and then I just feed the chain around. The top auger will turn, obviously. And I feed it till the chain so I get it out in the open so I can work with it. Then I take the splice link or master link, connect the chain back together, the link bridge, and then the clip. So I'm going to see if I can keep it from not flying out of the way. There, I clipped it in. Here, I'm going to insert the clip on the master link. I rotate it so it's in the notch. Pop it in and just check that they're in the notches on both sides and you're ready to go. So now once you have the master link clipped in, then you take and grab onto the idler sprocket. And you see we did loosen it up earlier. It's in a slot. And people ask, well, how tight do you want it? Well, what I do is just pull so the chain's good and snug. And then you'll need a 3/4 inch wrench. And you can use a ratchet, or I'm going to use an impact here. Put it on the end of your bolt. Draw the sprocket down so it's snug. There you go. You see, when I'm done, this is about perfect. The chain can wiggle a little bit. It's pretty snug, but you don't want it real loose. When you run them, they will run in. So if you think it's too tight, it'll run in and the chain will be fine. If it's necessary to put on new side guides because they're wore out, we do ship them with new fasteners. There's a square hole and it is a carriage bolt, so you insert the bolt in the hole. And I usually take a hammer and tap them in so you insert the square properly into the square hole. And then insert it onto the side of the blower that where you had removed it. put the 3/8 flanged nylock nuts on. And then tighten them up. You'll notice now when I tighten them, the bolt will only be flush with the outside of the nut. And the reason for that is if you hit the nylock early like you should, the fastener might turn in the square hole. So there is a reason for that. This is proper for this application. The reason is if we engaged in the nylock earlier, so we expose 2 or 3 threads beyond the nylock, the carriage bolt will spin in the UHMW plastic. So this is by design. And repeat on the other side, going through the same process. And with UHMW, you can over tighten them and just squash the plastic out. So just reasonable care. Like I said, the fastener should just be coming outside the nut. And you'll see when you take that off, there are UHMW guides in here. We do not use grease zerks. We use UHMW as a pivot bearing. So when this is assembled, there's a number of different parts here. There is a UHMW washer on both sides. I use grease. I put a little bit of grease on those washers, the UHMW washers, to keep them from moving. Slide this end washer in the pivot bushing in through the UHMW. And we have another washer on the inside that creates a space so the flipper does not rub on the blower. And reinsert it. Here's again where I'd put the guide pin in. And put the key in so that doesn't fall down. Then I proceed to tighten the fastener. Here takes an 1.5 inch socket and an 1.5 inch wrench. And once it's inserted, you can see you got to check that the flipper moves up and down properly, and you know that the shims are correct.